He thought no one would stop him. A bully choked Ronda Rousey's daughter in front of the entire school, while everyone stood by and filmed. But in the very next moment, the doors opened, and the UFC champion herself walked in. What happened next left the whole school in shock. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning had begun like any other, with the sound of the first bell echoing through the long halls of Westbrook High. Students rushed from one classroom to another, laughter and chatter bouncing off the lockers, sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Bright posters about friendship, tolerance, and respect were taped unevenly on the walls, though no one paid them much attention. They had become background noise, hollow reminders of ideals that often didn't match reality. In this particular school, those slogans felt more like decorations than truths. Among the crowd moved Lakia, a quiet girl with dark hair pulled neatly into a ponytail and a stack of books pressed tightly to her chest. She was the daughter of Ronda Rousey, though she rarely mentioned it. She didn't need the attention, and she certainly didn't crave the comparisons. Where her mother was fierce, outspoken, and unafraid of confrontation, Lakia was gentle, reserved, more comfortable in the silence of a library than in the storm of a school hallway. She preferred to watch rather than speak, to write her thoughts in the margins of notebooks instead of shouting them aloud. But being quiet made her a target. The way she lowered her gaze when spoken to, the way her answers were soft instead of sharp, the way she tried to avoid conflicts, it gave some the wrong impression. To them, she wasn't a thinker or a dreamer. She was weak. The corridor seemed to know when he was coming. Conversations dulled to whispers, then to silence, until all that could be heard was the thud of heavy sneakers and the scrape of a belt buckle against a locker. Trevor Hayes, taller than most boys his age, broad-shouldered from hours spent lifting weights and from the raw arrogance of someone who believed the school was his kingdom, appeared at the far end of the hall. A small group of boys trailed behind him like satellites orbiting a star, laughing at every half-joke he muttered, waiting for him to decide what would be amusing today. Students parted almost naturally, stepping aside as Trevor made his way down the hall. Some turned their faces to the lockers, pretending to rummage inside. Others kept their heads down, as though lowering their gaze might make them invisible. Lakia noticed the shift in atmosphere too late. She was standing still, balancing her books, lost in thought about an upcoming history essay, when the sudden hush spread like a ripple through the hallway. Her stomach clenched. She knew this silence. Trevor's eyes found her, and that cruel grin tugged at his lips. He changed direction without hesitation, his followers moving with him like shadows. His gaze locked on the books clutched in her arms, on the calm posture she was struggling to maintain. He didn't need a reason. She was reason enough. Well, look who we've got here," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry down the corridor. A few students stopped to watch, some already fishing out their phones. "Ronda Rousey's little princess. Do you punch as hard as your mommy? Or are you just good at hiding behind her name?" Lakia tightened her grip on her books. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. She had promised herself that she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She bent down to slip her notebook deeper into the stack, trying to walk past him without a word. Trevor shifted quickly, shoulder-checking her as she moved, and the book spilled from her arms onto the floor. Papers scattered like snow across the polished tiles. A ripple of laughter burst from his friends, sharp and cruel, echoing off the lockers. Lakia dropped to her knees, reaching for her things with trembling hands, refusing to look up at him. "Oops," Trevor said, smirking as he bent slightly toward her. "Didn't mean to do that. Guess you're just clumsy." Lakia's fingers brushed the edge of a drawing she'd been sketching, a small phrase of encouragement written in careful letters. "Stand tall, even in the storm." She crumpled it quickly, stuffing it back into her notebook, hoping he hadn't seen. But Trevor's eyes narrowed, catching just a glimpse of it. "What's this? Little speeches?" He laughed, straightening up. "You gonna be a lawyer one day? Defend people in court with your diary entries?" More laughter followed. Lakia swallowed hard. She wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him he knew nothing about her or her mother, but the words stuck in her throat. She kept her head down, reaching for another book. Trevor's sneaker suddenly slammed against the cover, pinning it to the floor. She froze. Slowly, she raised her eyes and met his. His grin widened, sensing victory. Around them, the corridor had filled with students, some openly recording the scene with their phones, others whispering to each other, their faces pale but curious. No one stepped forward. No one spoke up. "Come on," Trevor said, leaning closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Say something. Tell me to stop. Show me that famous Rousey fire." His tone was mocking, taunting, daring her to resist. Lakea's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her chest tightened, shame burning in her cheeks. She hated herself in that moment for being so still, for letting him control the scene. She wanted to scream, to fight, to be as fearless as her mother. But she wasn't her mother. Trevor's grin hardened into something darker. He stepped forward, crowding her against the lockers, one hand pressing against the metal just above her shoulder. The clang echoed down the hall, sharp and threatening. His friends cackled, urging him on, their voices blending into a cruel chorus. Lakea's hands clutched her books tighter against her chest, her knuckles white. She tried to edge sideways, but his arm blocked her path. Her breathing quickened. She thought of the posters on the walls, of the empty words about respect and kindness, and she realized how hollow they felt in this moment. "Don't walk away from me," Trevor said, his smile twisting. "We're not finished." The laughter swelled again, cruel and relentless, bouncing through the corridor like a storm she couldn't escape. Lakea pressed her back against the cold lockers, her body trembling, her mind screaming for someone, anyone to intervene. But all she saw in the eyes of her classmates was fear, indifference, or the glint of curiosity as they recorded her humiliation. Her world shrank to the sound of his voice, the weight of his presence, the echo of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She tried to remember her mother's words, the lessons she had whispered late at night about strength and courage, but they felt distant, unreachable. Trevor leaned closer, so close she could smell the sharp tang of his cologne mixed with sweat. His breath brushed her ear as he hissed, "What's it like being weak when your mom is supposed to be the toughest woman alive?" The words cut deeper than any shove or blow. Lakea closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself not to cry, not here, not in front of him. But the pressure in her chest grew heavier, her throat tightening as if the walls themselves were closing in. The laughter continued. The phones stayed raised. And as Trevor's shadow loomed larger over her, Lakea realized with a sinking dread that this wasn't going to end with spilled books or mocking words. This was only the beginning, the first step into something much darker. The bell rang again, shrill and piercing, but no one moved. The ordinary rhythm of school had been shattered, replaced by the oppressive silence of fear and the cruel theater unfolding in the hallway. Lakea pressed her back harder against the cold metal, clutching her books like a shield, as Trevor's hand slid closer, ready to push her once again into submission. In that moment, surrounded by indifferent eyes and cruel laughter, she understood the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. She was alone, and the nightmare was only beginning. The clang of the locker still echoed in Lakea's ears as Trevor pressed closer, his shadow blotting out the corridor light. The laughter around her had grown crueler, harsher, but there was an undercurrent of unease beginning to stir. She could feel it, the way some of the students shifted uncomfortably, the way a few phones trembled in their owners' hands as they recorded. Yet no one stepped forward. No one spoke. She was still alone. Trevor leaned back for a moment, flashing a grin at the crowd, playing his role as though the hallway were his stage and the students his audience. He yanked at the strap of her backpack, jerking it off her shoulder before she could tighten her grip. The bag hit the ground with a heavy thud, the zipper bursting open. Books spilled across the tiles, followed by a small collection of personal belongings. Her pens, a sketchbook, a lip balm, a photo of her with her mother, and a tiny keychain shaped like a pair of gloves, a gift from Ronda when she was younger. The photo fluttered away, landing face up in the middle of the circle. Trevor's gaze followed it, and the smirk on his lips deepened when he bent to pick it up. He held it high above his head for everyone to see. "Look at this," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Little family treasure. Mommy and daughter, smiling like they've got it all figured out. He dangled it in the air as though it were a worthless scrap of paper. But guess what? She's not here now. And you're nothing like her. The laughter burst again, echoing, sharp enough to cut. Lakia lunged for the photo, desperate to snatch it back. But Trevor pulled his hand higher, shaking it like bait in front of her. The effort made her stumble, and when she reached again, he let the photo drop. For a fraction of a second, she thought he would let her pick it up. But before she could touch it, his sneaker came down hard, grinding the image beneath his soul. The sound she made was small, a broken gasp that only those closest to her could hear. She froze, staring at the edge of her mother's smile, vanishing under the dirt of Trevor's shoe. Her throat tightened. Anger flared somewhere deep inside, but fear drowned it, leaving her trembling. "Oops," Trevor said casually, lifting his foot to reveal the crumpled, dirty photograph. "Guess it's not as tough as her either." Lakia bent quickly, snatching the photo from the ground, her hands shaking so violently she nearly tore it herself. She pressed it against her chest, curling around it, as if shielding it from further harm. Her eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not now. Trevor wasn't done. He tipped the rest of the contents of her bag out with a careless shove, scattering pencils, crumpled papers, and her sketchbook. The notebook slid across the floor, pages flipping open to reveal doodles, half-written phrases, and tiny speeches she wrote for herself when nights felt heavy and mornings unbearable. "What's this?" Trevor asked, bending down to scoop it up. He flipped through the pages as though they belonged to him. "Justice, fairness, no one should stand alone." He read aloud in a mocking, sing-song tone, drawing out each word as his friends cackled behind him. "Listen to this. Lawyer girl wants to change the world. How cute. Maybe you should try standing up for yourself first." The humiliation seeped into her skin like poison. Every word he read felt like a violation, exposing pieces of herself she never wanted them to see. She lunged forward again, but he held the notebook out of reach, then snapped it shut with a loud clap. Without hesitation, he tossed it back onto the ground, the pages bending as it landed. "Pick it up," he ordered. His voice had changed, grown sharper, colder. "Go on, crawl on the floor. Show everyone who you really are." Her face burned. She knelt down slowly, her fingers brushing the cover, when Trevor's foot slammed against it again, pinning it just as he had pinned her book earlier. He leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her, his grin cruel. "You're weak," he whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "And everyone here knows it." The chorus of laughter filled the hall again. She wanted to scream at them, at all of them, for standing there, for watching, for recording, for doing nothing. Instead, her silence betrayed her, making her seem smaller, weaker. She pulled at the book, but his weight held it down. Something cracked inside her. Her mind screamed her mother's words. "Never let them decide who you are. You are stronger than you think." But the words clashed with the reality before her. Her lungs were tight, her heartbeat frantic, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Strength felt like a distant dream, unreachable in this sea of laughter. Trevor released the book suddenly, only to grab her by the collar of her jacket. With one sharp tug, he hauled her upright and shoved her hard against the lockers. The clang reverberated through her bones, sharp pain radiating across her back. Her books fell again, sliding across the floor, but no one moved to help her. He pressed closer, his forearm pinning her against the metal, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot, sour, suffocating. "What's it like," he hissed, "to live in your mother's shadow? To know you'll never be her? To know that without her name, you're just a nobody?" The words hit harder than his shove. She bit her lip, trying not to break, but the tears pooled faster, threatening to spill. She turned her head away, but he grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Look at me," he ordered. "Look at me when I talk to you." Her vision blurred, her chest heaved, and for a moment she thought she would collapse. The fear was overwhelming, a wave she couldn't resist. She gasped for breath, her throat tight, her lungs straining. And then his hand moved. He slid his palm upward, clamping around her throat. The sudden pressure made her eyes widen. Her back slammed harder against the lockers as his grip tightened. Her hands flew to his wrist instinctively, clawing, tugging, but his strength far outmatched hers. The world narrowed to the pressure at her neck, the desperate need for air, the rush of panic screaming through her veins. Students fell silent. The laughter stopped. Phones still pointed at her, recording every second, but now even those who had cheered before looked uneasy. A murmur ran through the crowd, low and uncertain, like the beginning of a storm. Someone whispered, "He's going too far." But no one stepped forward. Lakia's vision blurred further. She heard the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears, faster and faster, until it became unbearable. Her fingers clawed at Trevor's arm, but his grip only tightened. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a broken rasp escaped. Trevor's face twisted, caught between rage and triumph. He wanted to prove something, not just to her, but to everyone watching. His power, his dominance, his control. He wanted to show that not even the daughter of a world-famous fighter could escape him. Her knees buckled, her body sagging against the lockers. Black spots danced in her vision. Her chest heaved, but air wouldn't come. She thought of the photo pressed inside her palm, bent and dirty, and of her mother's smile in it. For a fleeting moment, she wished her mother were here. And then the thought slipped into panic. Maybe she never would be. A ripple moved through the crowd again. Someone lowered their phone. Another took a small step forward, then stopped. The silence was heavy, suffocating, almost as crushing as Trevor's grip. Lakia's eyes rolled upward, her body going limp, her hands falling weakly to her sides. Trevor leaned closer, his lips curling into a cruel smile, savoring the moment. Around them, the students stood frozen, trapped between the thrill of the spectacle and the horror of what they were witnessing. The world seemed to slow, every second stretching unbearably long, until all that existed was the sound of her ragged gasps, the clench of his hand, and the oppressive silence of an entire hallway too afraid to intervene. And in that silence, Lakia realized the truth with a clarity that cut through the haze of fear. She couldn't win this. Not here. Not now. Her strength was fading, her body giving up, and as the darkness edged closer, she understood with terrible certainty that unless someone changed the course of this moment, she might not survive it. The humiliation had spiraled into something far more dangerous. It was no longer just about laughter or pride. It was about survival. And the corridor, once filled with laughter, now stood paralyzed in the shadow of that brutal truth. The grip on Lakia's throat tightened, the heat of Trevor's hand searing into her skin as though it meant to leave a permanent mark. The world had already begun to collapse into a tunnel of blurred shapes and muted sounds, every heartbeat echoing like a drum inside her skull. Her knees trembled violently, unable to hold her up much longer, and her chest convulsed with a desperate attempt to drag in air that never came. The crowd around them had fallen almost entirely silent now. No laughter, no jeers, only the faint hum of uncertainty and the cold glow of phone screens capturing every terrible second. The silence itself was suffocating, complicit, an audience paralyzed between shock and curiosity. Lakia's vision was nearly gone when the corridor changed. At first she thought it was her mind giving way, another symptom of the darkness that was overtaking her. But then she realized the change wasn't inside her. It was outside. The murmur of voices faltered, then ceased entirely. One by one, the phones lowered, and the crowd of students shifted uneasily as something pressed into the atmosphere, heavy, commanding. Even Trevor, though still holding her in his grip, glanced up, distracted by the new energy seeping into the hall. The sound came first. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing with a weight that no other sound in the school could rival. Each step struck the polished floor like a hammer, not loud in volume but devastating in effect, carrying an authority that froze every whisper in the throats of those who heard it. The crowd began to part instinctively, shoulders pressing against lockers, heads bowing, as though the presence approaching demanded reverence even before it appeared. Through the blur in her eyes, Lakia thought she saw a figure at the end of the hall, moving steadily toward her. She blinked, unsure if her mind was playing cruel tricks, as the oxygen slipped from her body. The figure grew clearer with each step. Broad shoulders, a posture defined by discipline, a gaze that seemed fixed straight ahead. Trevor shifted, his hands still clamped around her throat, but his expression twitching into something less certain. The laughter of his friends died entirely, leaving only their nervous breathing as they too turned to face the figure drawing near. The silence now was absolute. It wasn't the silence of complicity anymore. It was the silence of awe, of fear, of the sudden understanding that something unstoppable had entered the scene. The footsteps stopped just short of the circle. Lakia forced her eyes open, tears clinging to her lashes, and through her blurred vision, she finally saw her mother. Ronda Rousey stood there, framed in the fluorescent lights of the hallway, her figure unmistakable, her presence commanding. She had come to the school for something as mundane as a parent meeting, but what she had walked into was something else entirely. The sight of her daughter pinned against lockers, gasping for air in the hands of a boy swollen with arrogance, lit a fire in her that every student in that hallway could feel radiating off her skin. She did not rush forward. She did not scream. She simply stood for a moment, her eyes fixed on Trevor, with the kind of calm that carried more menace than rage ever could. Her gaze was steady, sharp, dissecting him where he stood. The power in her stillness was overwhelming. It was the quiet before a storm, the moment when even the air seemed to hold its breath. "Let her go." The words left her mouth low and controlled, yet the sound carried to every corner of the hallway. There was no need to raise her voice. Her authority was not in the volume. It was in the certainty, the unshakable conviction in each syllable. Trevor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden command. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He looked down at Lakia, who was slumped against the lockers, her hands weakly pulling at his wrist, then back up at the woman standing a few feet away. Recognition dawned on his face. His lips curled, but the smirk was forced, brittle. "You," he stammered, his voice catching in his throat. "You're—" He cut himself off, as if the words failed him. His grip on Laakia's throat loosened slightly without him realizing it, his bravado faltering. Rhonda's eyes never wavered. They locked onto him with a steadiness that made him feel like prey caught in a hunter's sightline. She didn't need to announce who she was. Every student already knew. Every student already felt it in their bones. The crowd began to draw back further, giving her space, opening a path as if compelled by instinct. Even the teachers who had emerged at the far end of the corridor, uncertain of how to respond, hesitated now, recognizing the unmistakable aura of control radiating from her. "Let her go." The command was slower this time, colder. Trevor swallowed, his throat bobbing. His hand fell away from Laakia's neck as though burned, and she collapsed forward, dropping to her knees on the tile, gasping desperately for air. She clutched her chest, drawing in ragged breaths, the oxygen burning her lungs, but she didn't look away from her mother. Relief and shock coursed through her body in equal measure. Rhonda's eyes shifted down to her daughter for a fleeting moment, softening just enough to show recognition, but then they returned to Trevor. She took a single step forward, the sound of her foot against the floor reverberating like a drumbeat. He instinctively stepped back, his shoulder brushing against one of his silent friends. The boy who had moments earlier been triumphant and untouchable now looked smaller, less certain, his dominance crumbling under the weight of her calm. Rhonda's expression remained unreadable, her voice still low but carrying the force of an earthquake. "You think strength is about who you can break? You're wrong." Her words didn't rise in volume, but every student felt them like a blow. "Strength is about who you can protect." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Trevor's grin twitched, desperate, forced, but the silence of the crowd offered him no support. No laughter rose to meet his cruelty. No applause followed his mockery. The audience that had once been his was no longer his to command. Their eyes were on her. Lakia coughed, still struggling to steady her breath, but her gaze never left her mother's back. For the first time since the morning began, she felt something different stirring inside her chest. She wasn't alone. She wasn't invisible. And as she watched Trevor shrink before the calm ferocity of Ronda Rousey, She realized that the tide had turned, that the humiliation which had spiraled so far was about to collapse in on itself. Trevor took another hesitant step back, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. Ronda advanced slowly, each step deliberate, each step eroding what little strength he thought he had. The air in the hallway was suffocating, thick with tension, and yet for the first time all day, Lakia felt like she could breathe. The silence was absolute now. No phones raised, no whispers exchanged, no nervous chuckles. Only the slow, deliberate sound of Ronda Rousey's footsteps filling the corridor, closing the distance between predator and prey. And in that silence, every student knew that the balance of power had shifted forever. The silence in the hallway had become unbearable. Lakia, still crouched on the floor with her chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps, clutched her crumpled photograph against her heart, her eyes locked on her mother's figure. Ronda had not rushed to her side. She hadn't even lifted a hand. Instead, she stood between her daughter and the boy who had moments ago believed himself king of the school, and her presence alone had turned the air to stone. The crowd felt it. The students who had once cheered Trevor now staring in wide-eyed awe, their phones lowered, their mouths dry. They were seeing something they had never seen before. Real power, unshaken, disciplined, and absolute. Trevor shifted uncomfortably, trying to disguise the quiver in his hands with a forced smirk. His friends, who only minutes earlier had been laughing and egging him on, now stood back, their eyes darting between Ronda and him, unwilling to share his spotlight. He tried to laugh, though his voice cracked. "We were just messing around. It's no big deal. Everyone knows it's just a joke." Ronda's gaze pierced him, still and cold. She didn't need to shout to make her authority felt. "You think this is a joke?" Her voice was soft, but the edge in it could have sliced steel. She took a single step forward, and the sound of her boot against the tile was louder than any laugh that had filled that corridor. Trevor instinctively stepped back, bumping against one of his friends, who quickly moved aside, unwilling to stand with him in that moment. Trevor raised his chin, searching for bravado, clinging to the shreds of the arrogance that had once shielded him. "Look, I didn't mean anything. She's fine. Everyone's fine. We were just playing around." He gestured vaguely toward Lakia, who was still trembling, her fingers clutching the photograph as though it were her lifeline. "Is she fine?" Ronda asked, her eyes never leaving him. Her tone was unyielding, pressing him into a corner. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat. The silence that followed was his answer. She closed the distance with a steady calm that made every student lean forward, holding their breath. Trevor tried to back away again, but this time there was nowhere to go. The lockers pressed against his shoulder blades, the cold metal reminding him of where his victims had stood moments earlier. He looked around, desperate for support, but the crowd that had once celebrated his cruelty now gave him nothing. They stood motionless, transfixed by the sight of her. Ronda moved in with precision, her body flowing like water, yet carrying the force of a storm. Trevor lashed out suddenly, shoving Lakia aside in a final act of cowardice, using her as a shield to create space between himself and the woman approaching. Lakia stumbled, catching herself on her hands, but before Trevor could retreat more than a step, Ronda's hand snapped forward. She seized his wrist with lightning speed, her grip like iron. Trevor yelped, twisting instinctively, but it was too late. In one smooth, practiced motion, she turned her body, pulling him forward with her. Her hip pivoted, her stance lowering, and with the force of years of discipline and mastery, she executed a flawless throw. Trevor's body lifted from the ground, his feet flailing helplessly in the air, and in an instant he slammed onto the tile floor with a crash that silenced the hallway completely. Gasps erupted from the students. Some dropped their phones, the clatter echoing faintly as the weight of what they had just seen settled over them. Trevor lay stunned, blinking at the ceiling, the arrogance wiped clean from his face. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, his chest heaving as though the fall had knocked the air from his lungs. Ronda didn't step back. She crouched low, still gripping his wrist, twisting it with a control that brought him to a gasp of pain without breaking him. The movement was efficient, calculated, designed not to destroy but to dominate. Trevor's eyes widened as he realized how easily she had stripped him of his power, how quickly she had reduced him from predator to prey. He squirmed, but every attempt to move only deepened the ache in his arm. "Let me go," he hissed, his voice cracking. "This isn't fair. You can't do this." "Fair," Rhonda repeated, her eyes narrowing. She leaned closer, her voice a cold whisper that only he could hear, though the intensity in her expression made the entire hallway feel the weight of her words. "You think it's fair to put your hands on someone weaker than you? You think it's fair to humiliate, to hurt, to crush them while others laugh?" Trevor swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling like ash. His lips trembled, his eyes darting away, searching the crowd for someone, anyone, to rescue him. But there was no one. Even his closest friends lowered their gazes, unwilling to stand with him. Rhonda applied a fraction more pressure, and Trevor whimpered, his body twisting instinctively under the hold. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. This is what control feels like. Real control, not the kind you steal from fear, but the kind that comes from discipline. The words cut deeper than the pain in his arm. For the first time, Trevor's face shifted, not with arrogance or cruelty, but with fear. The crowd saw it, and in that moment, the boy who had ruled the hallways through intimidation and laughter looked small, fragile, and utterly powerless. She held him there for another breath, another second that stretched into eternity before releasing the pressure just enough to let him move without breaking. He slumped to the floor, clutching his wrist, his body shuddering from the humiliation as much as from the pain. Rhonda rose slowly, her presence towering above him, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. No one moved. No one dared. The silence was so profound it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Her eyes returned to Trevor. "If you ever touch her again, if you ever lay a hand on anyone like that again, I won't stop at reminding you. I'll teach you in a way you'll never forget." Her voice was low, deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. Trevor's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his eyes downcast, unable to meet hers. The boy who had strutted through the halls as though they were his domain now looked like nothing more than a child stripped of his illusions. The crowd remained frozen, but their faces told the story. Awe, fear, respect. Laakea, still on the floor a few feet away, pushed herself up onto her knees, her wide eyes fixed on her mother. She had known Rhonda was strong. The world knew it. But to see it here, to see it wielded not for fame or glory, but for her, filled her with a tidal wave of relief and pride. The hum of whispers finally began to rise, faint, uncertain, like the first drops of rain before a storm. The silence was breaking, but the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily in the air. Every student there understood that they had witnessed something that would not be forgotten, not in days, not in years. The dynamic of their school had shifted forever. Rhonda remained calm, her breathing steady, her gaze sharp as she straightened to her full height. Trevor curled slightly on the ground, his body trembling, his pride shattered. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't mock. They simply watched, caught in the gravity of what had just unfolded. And in that moment, everyone knew the clash was far from over. A lesson was coming, one that would carve itself into their memories. The boy on the ground had been brought low, but the message that followed would strike deeper than any throw or hold. Laakea drew in a shaky breath, finally feeling the air fill her lungs without fear. For the first time that day, she felt safe. For the first time, she felt seen. And as her mother's shadow stretched across the floor, shielding her from the boy who had nearly broken her, she realized that the storm had only just begun. Trevor remained slumped against the lockers, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts, as though every breath was a fight. His friends, who had once been so eager to laugh at his cruelty, were now edging backward, their shoulders pressed tightly against the wall as if trying to blend into the crowd. The silence that filled the corridor was deafening, a silence unlike any that had come before. It was no longer the silence of fear or complicity. It was the silence of reckoning, of every student realizing they had witnessed something irreversible. The hierarchy of their school, so carefully maintained by intimidation and cruelty, had been shattered in an instant by the woman who stood in the center of it all. Rhonda had not raised her voice once, had not lashed out with wild anger, yet her presence had left Trevor trembling and the crowd paralyzed. She remained standing above him, her breathing calm, her body still, as though she carried all the time in the world. Her eyes swept the room, sharp and unwavering, pinning each student in place. They felt it, every one of them, the quiet demand that they look at themselves, that they confront the role they had played in the humiliation that had unfolded minutes earlier. Laakea, sitting on the floor a few feet away, pulled her knees to her chest, still trembling from the lingering fear, but steadying herself with each breath. Her eyes were locked on her mother, wide and wet with a mixture of awe and relief. She had seen her mother fight before, on television, in arenas where crowds screamed and lights flashed, but she had never seen her like this. Here there were no cameras, no referees, no championship belts. Here her mother's strength had been used for her, not for fame or for sport, but simply to protect. Trevor groaned faintly, shifting as though trying to recover what remained of his dignity. He pushed himself onto his elbows, his wrists still aching from the hold, his eyes darting nervously to the faces in the crowd. But no one offered him support. No laughter rose to meet him. No approving smiles cheered him on. The loyalty he had taken for granted had evaporated. He was alone. Rhonda crouched slightly, just enough to bring herself closer to him, her shadow still looming large across his body. Her voice was steady, quiet, yet it carried through the corridor with a clarity that no one could escape. You thought this was strength, shoving someone smaller than you, laughing while she gasped for air, using fear to make yourself look powerful. Her words struck with the weight of truth, each one cutting deeper than any physical blow. Trevor tried to look away, but she leaned in closer, forcing his eyes back to hers. That isn't strength. That's cowardice. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft and uneasy. Students shifted on their feet, some lowering their heads in shame, others biting their lips as they realized how often they had stood in silence, how often they had laughed nervously at Trevor's cruelty just to keep themselves safe. Rhonda's words weren't only for him, they were for all of them. Real strength, she continued, her tone still calm, isn't about who you can break. It's about who you can protect. It's about standing in front of someone who can't fight for themselves and saying, "You'll have to go through me first." Her gaze swept across the hallway, pinning each student one by one. None of them dared to look away. Trevor's lips trembled. He wanted to protest, to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He had nothing to defend himself with, no audience to laugh at his jokes, no crowd to back his false bravado. He was cornered not by her grip, but by the truth she had laid bare. He lowered his gaze to the floor, shame burning across his face. Rhonda released a slow breath, then straightened to her full height. She looked around the corridor once more, her eyes hard but not cruel, her expression stern yet layered with something deeper. "All of you watched," she said, her voice rising just enough to reach every corner of the hall. "You filmed, you whispered, you laughed, and when she was on the ground, when his hand was around her throat, you did nothing." The words landed like thunder, reverberating through the students. Some shifted uncomfortably, others swallowed hard. Their phones lowered completely now. Laakea's breath hitched as she realized her mother wasn't just condemning Trevor. She was condemning all of them. "You think by doing nothing you're innocent?" Rhonda asked, her tone sharp, cutting. "You're not. Silence is permission. Laughter is encouragement. Looking away is the same as holding her down yourselves." The weight of her words pressed against every chest in the room. Students stared at their shoes, at the lockers, anywhere but at her, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze. Teachers at the far end of the corridor remained frozen, their faces pale, realizing they too were guilty of the same silence. Trevor shifted again, clutching his wrist, his eyes glistening with the sting of humiliation. For once he did not smirk, did not sneer, did not pretend. He sat broken on the floor, stripped of the power he had wielded so carelessly. His friends edged farther away, unwilling to share in his defeat. Rhonda's eyes softened slightly when they returned to Laakea. She extended her hand, steady and warm, and her daughter hesitated only a moment before slipping her trembling fingers into it. Rhonda helped her to her feet, guiding her gently as though she were made of glass. For the first time since the nightmare began, Lakea felt safe enough to breathe deeply. She leaned into her mother's side, holding tightly to her hand, the fear slowly giving way to relief. The sight of them together, mother and daughter, broke something in the crowd. A girl near the front lowered her phone completely and slipped it into her pocket, her cheeks flushed with shame. Another boy looked at Lakea differently now, no longer with the indifference he had shown before, but with a quiet respect. The shift spread slowly, rippling through the hall, as realization dawned on the faces of those who had stood by. Rhonda's final words hung in the air like an oath. Remember this. Power is not in your fists. It's not in how many people fear you. Power is in your control, in your discipline, in your choice to protect when others stay silent. That's strength, and that's the only kind that matters. She held the gaze of the crowd for one final moment, letting the lesson settle, letting it carve itself into their memories. Then, with a calmness that contrasted the storm she had just unleashed, she turned away from Trevor and began to lead Lakea down the corridor. The students parted without a word, creating a path for them. Some lowered their heads in shame, others in awe. No one reached for their phones now. The silence was not fearful anymore. It was reverent. It was the silence that follows truth when there is nothing left to say. Trevor remained on the floor, humiliated, broken, his face pale as he realized he had lost far more than a fight. He had lost the illusion of control, and though his body still ached from the throw, it was the sting of her words, the lesson delivered before everyone he sought to impress, that would leave the deeper scar. Lakea leaned into her mother's side as they walked, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the hall. Her breathing steadied, her shoulders relaxed, and though her throat still burned from his grip, she no longer felt the weight of helplessness. She was not alone anymore. She never had been. As they reached the end of the corridor, the tension that had gripped the building finally began to ease, but the memory of what had been said, what had been done, would linger far longer than the echoes of those footsteps. For the first time, the students of Westbrook High had seen what real strength looked like, and they would never forget it. The corridor was still heavy with the echo of Rhonda's words as she walked forward with Lakea pressed close to her side. Students moved instinctively out of the way, their bodies parting like water before a prow cutting through the waves. No one dared to lift their phones again. No one dared to whisper. The weight of what they had seen pressed into their skin, burned into their memory. The hallway, which minutes before had been filled with cruel laughter and the shrill sound of humiliation, now carried only the rhythm of footsteps and the shallow breaths of those who watched. Trevor remained on the floor, leaning against the lockers with his knees bent and his head bowed. His friends had slunk away to the edges of the crowd, too ashamed or too afraid to remain by his side. For all his power, all the fear he had inspired for so long, there was nothing left of it now. He looked smaller, stripped of his arrogance, reduced to a boy clutching his pride with trembling fingers. None of the students offered him comfort. They had followed him only because it was safe, only because they thought his cruelty gave him strength. But now they had seen what true strength looked like, and it was not in him. Lakea clung tightly to her mother's hand, her breathing steadying little by little as they moved down the hallway. Her throat still burned from the pressure of Trevor's grip. But the pain seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the warmth of her mother's presence. Every step she took felt lighter, every breath deeper, as though the suffocating weight that had pressed down on her for so long had finally lifted. She looked up at Rhonda's face, studying the calm lines, the unyielding gaze. To everyone else in that hallway, her mother was a force of nature, an unstoppable figure of discipline and justice. To her, in this moment, she was something even more powerful. She was safety. When they reached the center of the corridor, Rhonda stopped. The students halted with her, their silence deepening, as though the very building waited for her to speak again. She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping across the faces before her. She saw shame in some, awe in others, but most of all she saw the dawning realization that they had been part of something cruel, that their silence had nearly allowed it to destroy a girl who had never wronged them. Her voice, when it came, was low but filled with a quiet command that left no room for doubt. Remember this moment. Remember what you felt when you stood here, when you watched him put his hands on her and you did nothing. Remember the shame, and then remember what it felt like when you saw someone step in to stop it. That is the difference between cruelty and courage, between weakness and strength. The words spread through the hall like fire through dry grass. Students shifted uncomfortably, some biting their lips, some lowering their heads, but all of them listening. Ronda continued, her tone steady, each word deliberate. Strength is not in your fists. It is not in your laughter when someone else is suffering. It is not in how many people fear you. Strength is in your control, in your discipline, in your ability to protect. That is what matters. That is what endures. Her gaze lingered on Trevor for a long moment. He shifted under it, his face pale, his eyes red. He could not meet her stare. At last she turned away from him, the judgment already complete. There was no need for more words. His humiliation, his defeat, was enough. The lesson had been carved into him as surely as it had into the crowd. Ronda guided Laakea toward the end of the corridor, her steps slow but firm. The students parted once more, creating a path, their eyes following every movement. Teachers stood at the far end, uncertain whether to speak, whether to act, but they too said nothing. They simply watched as mother and daughter passed, the air thick with the understanding that something had shifted in the fabric of their school. Laakea tightened her grip on her mother's hand, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." Ronda looked down at her, and for the first time since entering the hallway, her expression softened. "You never have to thank me for protecting you," she said quietly. "But one day you won't need me to. One day you'll be strong enough to protect yourself and others." Laakea swallowed hard, her throat aching, but her heart swelled with something new. It wasn't just relief. It was pride. Pride in her mother, pride in herself for enduring, and pride in the knowledge that she carried part of that same strength within her. They reached the end of the corridor and Ronda paused once more. She turned back, her eyes scanning the students who had borne witness to the entire scene. The silence deepened again as they waited, knowing instinctively that her final words would be the ones they carried with them long after she left. "Power without control is nothing," she said, her voice ringing with quiet conviction. "Courage without compassion is empty. Discipline is what gives strength meaning. Remember that." And then she turned away, guiding Laakea through the doors and into the sunlight beyond the school. The air outside was fresh, cool, carrying none of the suffocating weight of the corridor. Laakea breathed deeply, her lungs filling easily now, her chest no longer tight. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, the warmth of her mother's hand in hers, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt safe in her own skin. Inside, the hallway remained silent long after they had gone. Students stood frozen, their phones forgotten, their faces pale with the knowledge that they had seen more than just a fight, more than just a confrontation. They had seen truth. They had seen the difference between cruelty and courage, between weakness and strength, between fear and justice. Trevor stayed where he was, hunched against the lockers, his pride shattered. His friends did not move to help him. His power, built on fear and cruelty, had evaporated. And though his body ached, though his wrist throbbed, it was not the pain that broke him. It was the knowledge that every student in that hallway had seen him for what he truly was, and that no performance, no arrogance, could ever give him back what he had lost. The silence lingered, thick and undeniable, a silence that carried with it the weight of change. Slowly the students began to disperse, their voices hushed, their eyes darting with shame and reflection. But the memory would not leave them. It would follow them, reminding them of the moment when a mother had walked into their world and taught them what true strength meant. For Laakea, the memory was different. As she walked beside her mother, she knew that she had been protected, yes, but she had also been shown something deeper. She had been reminded that she was not invisible, not powerless, not weak. She had survived the storm, and in its wake, she had discovered that part of her mother's strength lived within her too. And though the day had begun with humiliation and fear, it ended with something far greater. The understanding that even in the darkest moments, justice could still find a voice. And sometimes that voice came in the form of footsteps in a silent corridor, steady, unyielding, and unforgettable. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. Dive into our other videos for even more powerful stories, and share this one with your friends so they can feel it too. Your support keeps these stories alive. Be part of the journey.